Welcome to Cozy Jury. Tonight's story will test you. It's messy, it's complicated, and by the end, you will decide who's right and who's wrong. But before we begin, if you value what we're building here, hit like. Subscribe if you want more of this, but only if this is your kind of content. I'd rather earn it than beg for it. Drop a comment. Where are you right now and what time is it? I love knowing who's out there deliberating with us. Now get comfortable. You're not just listening. You're the jury. The fire's burning. The case is open. Let's begin. Felipe Vargas stood in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning in January, holding a single piece of paper that changed everything. Bank statement, his daughter's name, $9 million. It shouldn't have been there. The inheritance from Clara's grandfather, a man Felipe had barely known, a wealthy investor who'd kept his distance from the family for decades. The old man had died 6 months ago, and the lawyers had been clear. The money was Clara's, held in trust until her 26th birthday, or her wedding day, whichever came first. Felipe was named as the trustee, the sole person who could release the funds. And Clara had no idea any of it existed. The paper trembled in his hands, not from age, though at 60 his fingers weren't as steady as they used to be. This was something else, the kind of shaking that comes from your body rejecting what your eyes are showing you. Outside, Chicago's winter pressed against the windows, frost creeping across the glass in delicate patterns. Inside, the radiator hissed, clanked, the same sounds it had made for 30 years in this modest brick house on the south side. The coffee maker gurgled, finishing its cycle. Normal sounds, a normal morning, except for the $9 million that had just become his responsibility to protect. Felipe set the statement down on the kitchen table, face down, as if hiding it from view would make the problem disappear. His mind was already racing backward, retracing the last 3 months. Clara's engagement. The announcement that had come over Sunday dinner, her face glowing with that particular kind of happiness that makes a father's heart swell and break simultaneously. She'd brought Eduardo home before, of course. The real estate agent with the expensive watch and the BMW he parked carefully away from Felipe's 10-year-old Camry. The man who called Felipe sir with just enough emphasis to make it sound like an insult. The man who was going to marry Clara in 4 months, right after her 26th birthday. The man who would legally have access to $9 million the moment he said, "I do." Felipe's chest tightened. He moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street where he'd raised Clara alone after Maria died. Breast cancer. Clara had been 8. He'd been a 42-year-old engineer suddenly responsible for braiding hair and signing permission slips and explaining why Mommy wasn't coming home. He'd done it. All of it. The dance recitals and the college applications and the late-night talks about boys and dreams and the future. He'd worked double shifts to keep her in a good school district, to make sure she never felt the absence of money on top of the absence of her mother. And he'd done it well enough that Clara had grown into a strong, independent woman with a marketing degree and her own apartment in Lincoln Park, and a confidence that sometimes scared him. But this inheritance, this was different. His phone buzzed on the counter. Clara. Her text appeared on the screen. "Dad, can Eduardo and I come over for dinner tonight? Want to talk about the wedding?" 3 emojis, a heart, a ring, a house. She did that now, signed her messages with pictures instead of words. It made him feel old. He typed back, "Of course, mija." 6 o'clock? The Spanish endearment slipped out naturally, the way it always did when his emotions were running high. His own father had called him that. His mother too, before she passed. It was the sound of family, of unconditional love, of the bond that trumped everything else. Her response came immediately. "Perfect. Eduardo's mom might come too. That okay?" Felipe's jaw tightened. Catalina, Eduardo's mother, a woman who'd made it clear from their first meeting that she considered her son's choice of bride to be charitable at best. She owned a boutique in River North, wore clothes with designer labels Felipe couldn't pronounce, and had a way of looking around his house that made him want to apologize for the cracked tile in the bathroom and the furniture he'd bought at estate sales. "Fine," he typed back. Then, because Clara would worry if he seemed short, "I'll make your favorite, arroz con pollo." "Love you, Dad." "Love you too, baby girl." He set the phone down and returned to the bank statement. $9 million. The number seemed obscene. Fictional. The kind of money that existed in movies, not in the checking accounts of 26-year-old marketing coordinators from the south side of Chicago. Clara's grandfather, Roberto Mendoza, had built his fortune in tech stocks in the 90s, buying and selling at exactly the right moments, living modestly despite his wealth. He'd been estranged from the family before Felipe even married Maria. Some argument about money, about values, about Roberto's refusal to help when Maria's parents fell on hard times. Felipe had met the man exactly twice, once at the wedding, once at Maria's funeral, where Roberto had stood in the back and left before the reception. And now, this. A final gesture from a man who'd ignored his granddaughter for 26 years. A fortune with strings attached. Strings that Felipe was now holding in his weathered hands. The real question, the one that made his stomach turn, was simple. Did Eduardo know? Felipe thought back to the engagement dinner. Eduardo had chosen the restaurant, a steakhouse in the Loop, where the cheapest entree cost $40 and the wine list required a sommelier to navigate. Felipe had worn his best suit, the one he saved for weddings and funerals, and felt underdressed the moment he walked in. Clara had been radiant, her hand constantly moving to the diamond on her finger, a stone that caught the light from every angle. Eduardo had ordered for the table without asking anyone's preference. "Trust me," he'd said, flashing that white-toothed smile. "I know what's good here." The meal had been excellent. The conversation had been excruciating. "So, Felipe," Eduardo had said, swirling his wine glass in a way that suggested he'd taken a class on it. "Clara tells me you're retired now. Must be nice. What do you do with all that free time?" Felipe had bristled at the implication that retirement was leisure rather than the result of a body worn down by decades of physical labor. "I keep busy," he'd said, "volunteering at the church, fixing things around the house, spending time with Clara when she lets me." Clara had laughed, squeezing his hand across the table. "Dad's being modest. He basically runs the food bank." They'd fall apart without him. Eduardo had nodded, the gesture polite but dismissive. "That's great, really great. Community service is important." The way he said it suggested he ranked it somewhere below recycling and above nothing at all. Then Catalina, who'd been invited to join them, had chimed in. "Eduardo's doing quite well in real estate, just closed a deal on a property in Gold Coast. The commission alone was more than most people make in a year." "Mom," Eduardo had said, but he was smiling. Proud, Clara had looked uncomfortable. "Eduardo works really hard," she'd offered. "Of course he does," Catalina had continued. "That's why I keep telling him he needs to be smart about his future, about who he builds that future with." She'd glanced at Clara, and the look had said everything. "You're lucky my son chose you." Felipe had felt his blood pressure rising. He'd opened his mouth to say something, to defend his daughter, but Clara had kicked him gently under the table, a warning. "Don't make a scene, Dad." So he'd swallowed his pride and his anger and finished his overpriced steak in silence. Later, when Eduardo went to the bathroom and Catalina was on her phone, Clara had leaned close to Felipe. "I know she's a lot," she'd whispered. "But Eduardo's not like her. He loves me for me. You'll see." And Felipe had wanted to believe her, had tried to believe her, but something in Eduardo's eyes when he talked about money, about success, about the life he planned to build, set off alarms that Felipe couldn't ignore, the kind of alarms that come from 60 years of watching people, of learning to read the difference between kindness and performance, between love and transaction. Now, standing in his kitchen with the knowledge of $9 million burning a hole in his conscience, those alarms were screaming. Did Eduardo know about the inheritance? Had Roberto's lawyers contacted Clara? Had they sent letters to her apartment, letters that Eduardo might have intercepted? The will had been very specific. The money was Clara's, but the trustee, Felipe, had discretion over the timing of the release. He could hold it until he felt Clara was ready, until he felt she was protected. The lawyers had called it a safeguard, Felipe's father-in-law's final attempt to make sure the money went to his granddaughter, not to whoever might try to exploit her. Felipe picked up the statement again. He thought about calling Clara right now, telling her everything, letting her make her own choice. She was an adult. She had every right to know, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of Eduardo's hand on her back at dinner, possessive in a way that made Felipe's skin crawl. Maybe it was Catalina's thinly veiled contempt for Clara's modest upbringing. Maybe it was simply a father's instinct, honed over 18 years of solo parenting, telling him that his daughter was in danger. Or maybe he was wrong. Maybe Eduardo genuinely loved Clara. Maybe the expensive dinners and the designer watch and the talk about investment properties were just the trappings of a successful young man, not the warning signs of a gold digger. Maybe Felipe was letting his own insecurities about money and class poison his judgment. But $9 million. That changed everything. That wasn't just a nest egg or a down payment on a house. That was generational wealth. That was the kind of money that made people do terrible things. That revealed true character. Felipe made his decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He would wait. He would watch. He would protect his daughter the only way he knew how, by keeping this secret until he was absolutely certain that Eduardo's love was real. And if it turned out Felipe was wrong, if Eduardo proved himself worthy, then he'd release the funds with his blessing and apologize for doubting. But if he was right, if his instincts were screaming for a reason, then this secret might be the only thing standing between Clara and a lifetime of regret. He folded the bank statement and locked it in the fireproof safe in his bedroom closet, the same safe where he kept Maria's wedding ring and Clara's birth certificate and the deed to the house. Documents that mattered, truths that needed protection. Then he went to the grocery store to buy chicken and rice to prepare a meal for his daughter and the man who wanted to marry her, to smile and nod and play the role of the supportive father while his heart hammered with the weight of what he knew and what he feared and what he absolutely could not say, not yet, not until he was sure. You might think you know exactly what happened here. Father doesn't trust daughter's fiancé, decides to play God with her inheritance. Simple, right? But it's not that simple. Because this bank statement wasn't the end. It was the trigger for a war that would tear this family apart in ways Felipe never imagined. Before this story is over, there will be lawyers and accusations and a choice that will make some of you call it justice and others call it betrayal. Was Felipe right to keep this secret? Hold that thought. Let's go back to the beginning, to the very first red flag that everyone missed. Felipe met Maria Mendoza in the summer of 1983 at a church picnic on the shores of Lake Michigan. He was 21, fresh out of engineering school, full of ideas about building bridges and designing systems that would last forever. She was 19, studying to be a teacher, with eyes that seemed to catch every detail and a laugh that made everyone around her want to join in. They'd been introduced by mutual friends, and Felipe had been so nervous that he'd spilled lemonade down his shirt within the first 5 minutes of conversation. Maria had handed him a napkin without missing a beat and said, "Good thing you're an engineer and not a waiter." They were married 2 years later in a small ceremony at St. Ignatius, with Maria's parents offering quiet support and Roberto Mendoza conspicuously absent. The rift between Roberto and his daughter had been growing for years. He'd wanted Maria to pursue business, to join his growing investment firm, to learn the art of making money multiply. She'd wanted to teach children, to shape young minds, to measure success in ways that had nothing to do with net worth. When Roberto refused to pay for her education unless she changed her major, Maria had taken out loans and worked 3 jobs to put herself through college. The pride in her voice when she told Felipe that story had made him love her even more. Their honeymoon had been a weekend in Wisconsin, camping by a lake, cooking hot dogs over a fire, talking about the future they'd build together. Maria had a teaching job lined up at an elementary school in Englewood. Felipe had just been hired by a construction firm, designing structural supports for buildings that would outlast them both. They'd rented a 1-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, furnished it with hand-me-downs and thrift store finds, and been happier than Felipe had ever imagined possible. Those first years had been golden. Maria would come home from school with stories about her students, about the boy who'd finally understood multiplication, or the girl who'd written a poem that made Maria cry with its raw honesty. Felipe would talk about the challenges of his projects, the satisfaction of solving problems that seemed impossible on paper, but made perfect sense once you understood the physics. They'd cook together in their tiny kitchen, dancing to salsa music on the radio, planning for the day when they'd have enough saved for a down payment on a house. Clara had arrived in 1998, after 5 years of trying and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages that had tested their marriage in ways nothing else could. When Maria finally held their daughter for the first time, Felipe had seen something shift in her eyes, a completion, a purpose that went beyond even the deep love they shared. Clara became the center of their universe, the reason they worked and saved and dreamed. Roberto had sent a card when Clara was born. No visit, no phone call, just a card with a check for $500 and a note that said, "For the baby's future." Maria had cashed the check, put the money in a savings account for Clara, and never heard from her father again. Felipe had watched his wife grieve that relationship in quiet moments, but she'd never let it poison the joy she found in their little family. "Some people don't know how to love," she'd told Felipe once. "That's their loss, not ours." The house in Beverly had been a stretch financially, but they'd made it work. Felipe had taken on overtime, and Maria had started tutoring in the evenings. The neighborhood was safe, the schools were good, and Clara would have a yard to play in. They'd moved in when Clara was 3, and Felipe could still remember the way she'd run from room to room, her little footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, claiming her pink bedroom as her castle. Those middle years had been the best of Felipe's life. He'd wake early to the sound of Clara's laughter mixing with Maria's gentle corrections. Breakfast at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, Felipe reading the paper while Maria helped Clara with her letters. Work would be long and sometimes brutal, but coming home to his family made every aching muscle worth it. Weekends were for the park, for bike rides along the lakefront, for teaching Clara to swim at the public pool. Money was always tight, but they had enough. More than enough, because they had each other. Clara had been 7 when Maria found the lump. At first, Maria had brushed it off, too busy with the start of the school year to worry about something that was probably nothing. By the time she'd seen a doctor, the cancer had spread to her lymph nodes. Stage 3. Treatable, the oncologist had said, but the word that stuck with Felipe was aggressive. The next year had been a blur of chemotherapy and radiation, of watching Maria's beautiful hair fall out in clumps, of lying to Clara about why Mommy was so tired all the time. Maria had fought with everything she had, determined to see Clara grow up, to be there for first days of school and dance recitals and eventually a wedding of her own. But cancer doesn't care about determination. It doesn't negotiate. By Clara's 8th birthday, Maria was in hospice, and Felipe was learning how to be both mother and father to a little girl who kept asking when Mommy was coming home. Maria had died on a Tuesday in October, with the leaves turning gold outside the window, and Clara at school, blissfully unaware that this would be the day her childhood ended. Felipe had been holding Maria's hand when she took her last breath, and he'd felt something fundamental break inside himself. Not just grief, though there was plenty of that, but the loss of his partner, his co-pilot, the person who'd made every challenge manageable just by being there to face it with him. Roberto hadn't come to the funeral. He'd sent flowers, expensive ones, the kind that made a statement. Felipe had wanted to throw them away, but Maria's mother had stopped him. "He's grieving in his own way," she'd said. Felipe had doubted that then, and doubted it now. Raising Clara alone had been the hardest thing Felipe had ever done. He'd cut back his hours at work, taking a position that paid less but gave him the flexibility to be there for school pickups and parent-teacher conferences. He'd learned to braid hair by watching YouTube videos, though his attempts had been clumsy compared to Maria's effortless elegance. He'd sat through ballet classes and softball games, the only dad in a sea of mothers, trying to figure out how to talk to his daughter about periods and boys and the confusing emotions of adolescence. Clara had been a resilient kid, but Felipe could see the wound that Maria's death had left. She'd grown quieter, more independent, building walls that Felipe sometimes struggled to breach. He'd done his best to be everything she needed, the strict parent and the fun one, the disciplinarian and the comfort, the protector and the cheerleader. And somehow, impossibly, they'd made it work. High school had been a revelation. Clara had blossomed, joining the debate team and the student council, her confidence growing with each small victory. She'd had her share of teenage drama, boys who broke her heart, and friends who betrayed her trust, and Felipe had been there for all of it, offering advice when asked, and silent support when words weren't needed. She'd gotten into Northwestern on a partial scholarship, the rest covered by loans and Felipe's savings, and he'd never been prouder than the day he'd helped her move into her dorm. College had been harder in a different way. Clara had spread her wings, making friends Felipe never met, joining clubs and causes he didn't fully understand. She'd come home less frequently, always with some excuse about exams or projects or social commitments. Felipe had told himself it was natural, this pulling away. She was becoming her own person. But it still hurt to eat dinner alone in the kitchen where they'd shared so many meals. After graduation, Clara had gotten a job at a marketing firm in the Loop. The work was demanding but exciting, she'd told him. She'd moved into an apartment with 2 roommates in Lincoln Park, a neighborhood Felipe associated with young professionals and coffee shops that charged $7 for a latte. She'd invited him over once, and he'd felt out of place among the modern furniture and abstract art prints, so different from the comfortable clutter of his own home. Then about a year and a half ago, she'd mentioned someone named Eduardo. Just in passing, casually, the way you might mention a co-worker or a friend. "This guy from work introduced me to a real estate agent," she'd said. "Eduardo, he's helping me think about maybe buying a condo someday." Felipe had thought nothing of it at the time. 3 months later, Eduardo wasn't a real estate agent who worked with Clara's co-worker. He was Clara's boyfriend. She'd brought him to Sunday dinner, and Felipe had shaken the man's hand, noting the firm grip and the expensive cologne and the way Eduardo's eyes had swept over the house with an appraising look that made Felipe feel like he was being evaluated for a loan. Eduardo had been polite that first visit, charming even. He'd complimented Felipe's cooking, asked intelligent questions about his engineering background, and made Clara laugh with stories about disastrous open houses and demanding clients. But there had been something underneath the charm, a calculation. The way Eduardo had noted the older model television, the dated kitchen appliances, the family photos in drugstore frames, the way he'd asked, too casually, whether Felipe owned the house outright or still had a mortgage. The way he'd mentioned, as if it were nothing, that the neighborhood was up and coming, which Felipe knew was code for not quite good enough yet. Over the next year, Eduardo had become a fixture in Clara's life. She'd talked about him constantly, her face lighting up in a way that reminded Felipe painfully of Maria. They'd taken trips together, weekends in Michigan and a week in Cabo that Clara could barely afford, but had charged to her credit card because Eduardo says experiences are more valuable than things. They'd talked about the future, about moving in together, about the kind of life they wanted to build, and Felipe had watched and worried and kept his concerns to himself, because what could he say? That he didn't trust the man's smile, that something about Eduardo's ambition felt predatory rather than admirable. Clara would have dismissed it as fatherly overprotection, as an old man unable to accept that his little girl was grown. Then 3 months ago the engagement had happened. Eduardo had proposed at some rooftop restaurant with champagne and a ring that must have cost 3 months of Clara's salary. She'd called Felipe from the restaurant, crying happy tears, barely coherent with excitement. "Daddy, I'm getting married! Can you believe it? He asked me to marry him!" And Felipe had said all the right things. "Congratulations, and I'm so happy for you, and he's a lucky man," while his stomach had twisted into knots. Looking back now, with the knowledge of the inheritance sitting in his safe, Felipe could see the warning signs he'd rationalized away. The time Eduardo had joked about Felipe needing to start thinking about where he'd live when Clara and Eduardo bought their dream home, implying that this house, Felipe's house, would naturally be sold to fund their future. The comments about Clara needing to level up her wardrobe and her professional network. The subtle but persistent pressure for Clara to ask for raises and promotions to maximize her earning potential. And then there was Catalina. Eduardo's mother had made her position clear from the start. At that first dinner, when Felipe had served his homemade arroz con pollo, she'd taken one bite and said, "Interesting. Eduardo's father used to take me to this wonderful Spanish restaurant in the Gold Coast. Real authentic cuisine, you know, not like the Americanized versions." Felipe had smiled tightly and refilled her water glass. But the incident that really stuck with him had happened 2 months ago at a family gathering for Eduardo's birthday. Clara had brought Felipe along, insisting he needed to get to know Eduardo's family better. The party had been at Catalina's house, a sprawling place in Oak Park with a manicured lawn and a chandelier in the foyer. Felipe had felt underdressed despite wearing his best slacks and button-down shirt. The conversation had turned to money, as it often did when Catalina was involved. Someone had mentioned the rising cost of weddings, and Catalina had launched into a speech about the importance of maintaining standards and not cheaping out on the most important day of your life. Of course, some people have different priorities, she'd said, glancing at Felipe. Some people think that love is enough, that you don't need the trappings of success. But in my experience, financial security and social standing are what allow love to flourish. Without that foundation, relationships crumble under the weight of stress and disappointment. Clara had looked mortified. Eduardo had said nothing, which was somehow worse than if he'd defended Felipe. Felipe had excused himself to the bathroom and spent 5 minutes staring at his reflection in Catalina's gold-framed mirror, wondering what Maria would have done in his position. Would she have confronted Eduardo? Would she have trusted Clara to see the red flags on her own? Would she have been able to separate genuine concern from class resentment? He'd never know. Maria was gone, and Felipe was alone in trying to protect their daughter from what he increasingly feared was a terrible mistake. But he couldn't say any of that to Clara. Every time he'd tried to express even mild reservations about Eduardo, she'd shut him down. "You don't know him like I do, Dad. You're being overprotective." Just because you and Mum were happy being poor doesn't mean that's the only way to live. That last one had stung. Felipe and Maria hadn't been poor. They'd been comfortable, careful, focused on what mattered. But he could see how it might look to Clara's generation, to her friends who posted vacation photos on Instagram and talked about investment portfolios before they turned 30. So Felipe had backed off, had swallowed his concerns, had played the role of the supportive father, even as every instinct screamed that his daughter was making a mistake. Until the letter from Roberto's lawyer had arrived, informing Felipe of the inheritance and his role as trustee. Until the bank statement had materialized, showing $9 million in Clara's name, waiting for the moment she said "I do" to a man who might or might not love her for herself. Now, as Felipe stood in his kitchen preparing for tonight's dinner, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to come to a head. Clara and Eduardo and Catalina, all sitting around his modest dining table, talking about wedding plans and futures and dreams, while Felipe carried the weight of a secret that could destroy everything or save everything, depending on how you looked at it. He pulled the chicken from the refrigerator and began to season it, his hands moving through the familiar motions. Rice in the pot, sofrito in the pan, the smell of cumin and garlic filling the kitchen. The same meal he'd made 1,000 times, the recipe Maria had taught him during those early years when they'd been building their life together. Clara had texted again. "Running late. Be there by 6:30. Eduardo's mom is bringing wine." Of course she was. Probably something expensive that would make Felipe's beer look like a poor choice. He set the table for 4, using the good plates that rarely came out of the cabinet. He put fresh flowers in a vase, something Maria used to do. He tried to prepare himself mentally for the performance he'd have to give. The happy father, the welcoming host, the man who had no reservations about his daughter marrying into a family that made him feel inadequate every time they were in the same room. And underneath it all, the question that wouldn't stop echoing in his mind: does Eduardo know about the money? Has he been playing a long game, waiting for the inheritance to come through? Or am I seeing shadows where there's only light? Paranoia where there should be trust? Felipe looked at the clock. 30 minutes until they arrived. 30 minutes to decide how much of himself to reveal, how many questions to ask, how carefully to watch Eduardo's reactions. 30 minutes until the next chapter of this story began, with Felipe holding all the cards and absolutely no idea whether playing them would save his daughter or lose her forever. The fire crackled in his imagination. The jury was already forming their opinions, but the evidence was just beginning to present itself. And Felipe, standing in his kitchen with the smell of his late wife's recipe in the air, was about to face the first real test of his decision to keep the secret. You tell me, was he protecting Clara, or was he already setting in motion the very disaster he feared? Hold that thought, because what happened next would make that question a whole lot more complicated. They arrived at 6:45, a full 45 minutes late, with the kind of casual disregard for punctuality that suggested their time was more valuable than Felipe's. Clara came through the door first, her face flushed from the cold, her arms full of shopping bags from stores Felipe couldn't afford to browse in. She kissed his cheek, leaving a trace of expensive perfume, something floral and complex that had probably cost more than his grocery budget for the month. "Sorry we're late, Dad. Traffic was insane and then we had to stop because Eduardo needed to grab some documents from his office." Eduardo followed, shaking Felipe's hand with that firm grip that always felt like a competition. "Felipe, good to see you. Thanks for having us." He was wearing a cashmere sweater and designer jeans, an outfit that looked casual but probably cost more than Felipe's entire wardrobe. His watch caught the light, something Swiss and expensive that Felipe recognized from the ads in the magazines at the dentist's office. Catalina swept in last, carrying 2 bottles of wine that she handed to Felipe as if presenting him with a gift far beyond his deserving. "I brought a Bordeaux and a Rioja," she said. "I wasn't sure what you'd be serving, so I hedged my bets." "Arroz con pollo," Felipe said. "Clara's favorite." "How lovely," Catalina said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. Comfort food. There's something to be said for. Simplicity. They settled into the living room while Felipe finished the meal. He could hear them talking, Clara's voice bright with excitement, Eduardo's deeper tones occasionally interjecting, Catalina's sharp laugh at something one of them said. He felt like an outsider in his own home, the help preparing dinner while the important people discussed important things. When he called them to the table, they came with the wine already poured, expensive glasses that Catalina had apparently brought because she never knew what to expect in terms of stemware. Felipe's everyday glasses sat unused on the counter, a silent rebuke. The meal started pleasantly enough. Clara raved about the food, as she always did, and even Eduardo offered genuine-seeming compliments about the seasoning and the tenderness of the chicken. Catalina picked at her portion, eating enough to be polite, but making it clear through her body language that this was not her preferred cuisine. "So," Clara said, her eyes shining, "we wanted to talk to you about the wedding plans. We've been working with a planner, and we've got some really exciting ideas." Eduardo jumped in. "We're thinking the Drake Hotel for the reception. Classic, elegant, right in the heart of the city. The package we're looking at includes—" "Wait," Felipe said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "The Drake? Isn't that... how much does a venue like that cost?" Clara waved her hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it, Dad. Eduardo and I are handling most of it. His mum is contributing too. We just wanted to keep you in the loop." "I'd like to contribute," Felipe said. "You're my daughter. Your wedding is important to me." "That's sweet," Catalina said, and the patronizing tone made Felipe's jaw tighten. "But these things can get expensive quickly. The Drake alone is probably outside most people's budget. Eduardo and I have been discussing the importance of starting the marriage with the right impression. Social capital matters in his industry." Felipe looked at Eduardo. Is that true? You need an expensive wedding for your career? Eduardo shrugged, but there was something defensive in his posture. It's not about needing it. It's about wanting to celebrate properly. Clara deserves the best. She does, Felipe agreed. But the best doesn't always mean the most expensive. Dad, Clara said, warning in her voice. We're not having this conversation again. What conversation? Felipe asked innocently. The one where you imply that Eduardo is shallow or materialistic or whatever it is you think of him. The table went quiet. Catalina sipped her wine, watching the exchange with interest. Eduardo's expression was carefully neutral, but Felipe caught the flash of irritation in his eyes. I never said that, Felipe said carefully. I'm just trying to understand. You graduated with student loans. You're working an entry-level marketing job. Where is the money for a Drake Hotel wedding coming from? That's really none of your business, Eduardo said, his voice hardening. Clara and I are adults. We can manage our own finances. She's my daughter, Felipe said. That makes it my business. Actually, Catalina interjected, Eduardo has been quite financially responsible. He's been saving aggressively, and he's had a very good year in terms of commissions. Plus, I'm happy to help my son celebrate this milestone properly. The implication was clear. I can afford to give my son a proper wedding. Can you say the same for your daughter? Felipe felt his blood pressure rising. He took a breath, trying to remember that losing his temper would only prove their point about him being unreasonable. I'm just concerned, he said. Starting a marriage in debt isn't ideal. We won't be in debt, Eduardo said. I've got it under control. And after the wedding, Felipe pressed. You two are talking about buying a house, right? How does that work financially? Clara set down her fork. Why are you interrogating us? I'm not interrogating. I'm asking questions. Normal questions that a father asks when his daughter is about to make a major life decision. A major life decision? Eduardo repeated, his voice cold. You mean marrying me? I mean combining your lives in a legal and financial partnership, Felipe said. Have you two talked about a prenup? The silence that followed was arctic. Clara's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. Eduardo's jaw was clenched so tight Felipe could see the muscle jumping. Even Catalina looked surprised, though whether by the question or the audacity of Felipe asking it, he couldn't tell. A prenup, Clara said slowly. You want us to get a prenup? I didn't say I wanted you to, I asked if you'd discussed it. Why would we need a prenup? Eduardo asked, and there was something dangerous in his tone now. What exactly are you implying about my intentions toward your daughter? Felipe met his eyes. I'm not implying anything. I'm saying that 50% of marriages end in divorce, and it's smart to protect both parties financially before making a legal commitment. That's not romantic, but it's practical. It's insulting, Eduardo said. You're sitting here in your house that's probably worth a fraction of what Clara and I will own together, lecturing us about financial planning. You worked as an engineer for 40 years and have what to show for it? A mortgage you haven't paid off and a retirement that barely covers your expenses. Forgive me if I don't take financial advice from someone who never figured out how to build real wealth. The words hung in the air like a slap. Clara gasped. Catalina's eyebrows rose, but she didn't contradict her son. And Felipe felt something inside him go very cold and very calm. You're right, he said quietly. I don't have wealth. I have a house I've paid on for 30 years, raising my daughter alone after my wife died. I have a pension from 4 decades of honest work. I have savings that I carefully managed to put Clara through college. I don't have a BMW or a Rolex or a closet full of designer clothes. What I have is my daughter's best interests at heart, which is more than I can say for some people at this table. Dad! Clara stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. That's enough. Eduardo, I'm so sorry. Don't apologize for me, Felipe said, also standing. I'm not sorry for asking legitimate questions about my daughter's future. Legitimate questions? Eduardo's voice was rising now. You've been gunning for me since the day we met. Nothing I do is good enough. Nothing I say is right. I could cure cancer, and you'd find something wrong with my methods. That's not true, Felipe started, but Eduardo cut him off. It is true. You know what I think? I think you're threatened by me, by the life I can give Clara, by the fact that she's going to move on and up and leave this. He gestured around the dining room. Behind. You want to keep her small and dependent so you don't have to face being alone. The accusation hit Felipe like a physical blow. Clara was crying now, tears streaming down her face. Catalina sat back in her chair, looking satisfied, as if this was exactly the scene she'd been hoping for. You don't know anything about me, Felipe said, his voice shaking. You don't know what I've sacrificed or what I've built or what matters to me. You walk into my home, eat my food, and disrespect me in front of my daughter. And you wonder why I have concerns about you marrying her. Maybe you should focus less on your concerns and more on your own life, Eduardo shot back. Clara's an adult. She doesn't need your permission or your approval. We're getting married whether you like it or not. Eduardo, please, Clara said, reaching for his arm. This isn't helping. He shrugged her off. No, I'm done being polite. I'm done pretending like your father's opinion matters. He's going to be a problem, Clara. You need to decide whose side you're on. The ultimatum hung in the air. Felipe looked at his daughter, saw the conflict in her eyes, the tears on her cheeks, the way she was looking between him and Eduardo, like a child trying to choose between parents in a custody battle. Don't do that, Felipe said to Eduardo. Don't make her choose. I'm not making her do anything. I'm stating facts. You're either supportive of this marriage or you're not. And if you're not, then you don't get to be part of our lives. That's not your decision to make, Felipe said. Actually, it is. Clara and I are a team. We make decisions together. And we've already decided that we're not going to let negative people drag us down. That includes family members who can't get with the program. Clara was sobbing now, her hands over her face. Catalina stood, moving to Eduardo's side, her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of support. Felipe felt completely isolated, watching his daughter fall apart and unable to reach her across the chasm that had just opened up in his dining room. Clara, he said softly. Mia, look at me. She lowered her hands. Her makeup was running, her eyes red and swollen. She looked so young in that moment, so vulnerable, and Felipe wanted nothing more than to wrap her in his arms and make everything okay the way he had when she was little, and the monsters under the bed seemed real. I love you, he said. Everything I'm doing, everything I'm asking, is because I love you and I want you to be happy and safe. That's all. That's the only reason. Then prove it, Eduardo said, before Clara could respond. Support our marriage. Stop questioning every decision. Stop treating me like I'm not good enough. Be the father she deserves, not the obstacle she has to overcome. Felipe looked at Eduardo, at the challenge in his eyes, at the way he'd positioned himself as the reasonable one and Felipe as the problem. It was a masterful manipulation, he had to admit. Frame any dissent as unsupportive, make love conditional on compliance, isolate Clara from the one person who might see through the facade. I'll support my daughter, Felipe said, carefully. Always. But support doesn't mean blind agreement. It means trust, Eduardo said. It means believing that Clara is capable of making her own choices. Can you do that, Felipe? Can you trust your daughter? It was a trap, and Felipe knew it. If he said no, he was admitting he didn't trust Clara. If he said yes, he was agreeing to stop asking questions, to stop pushing back, to accept whatever Eduardo wanted without protest. He looked at Clara, saw her waiting for his answer, her whole body tense with anticipation. "I trust Clara," he said finally. "Completely." "Good," Eduardo said. "Then we're done here. Clara, get your things. We're leaving." "Eduardo, wait," Clara said, but he was already moving toward the door. Catalina followed him, pausing only to say to Felipe, "This could have been pleasant. You're the one who made it ugly." Then she was gone, the sound of her heels clicking down the hallway. Clara stood in the middle of the dining room, looking between Felipe and the door, torn. "Dad, Go," Felipe said, even though it killed him. "We'll talk later." She grabbed her coat and her purse, hesitating at the door. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, baby girl." Then she was gone, and Felipe was alone in the wreckage of the dinner he'd prepared with such care. The food was getting cold on the table. The expensive wine Catalina had brought was mostly full, wasted. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the old clock in the hallway and the sound of Felipe's own breathing. He sat down heavily in his chair and put his head in his hands. He'd handled that all wrong. He'd let Eduardo bait him, had responded with exactly the kind of defensiveness that made him look like the unreasonable one. He'd pushed when he should have held back, had challenged when he should have listened. But beneath the self-recrimination was a cold, hard certainty. Eduardo had shown his true colors tonight. The disrespect, the manipulation, the way he'd used Clara as a weapon against her own father. And the comment about Felipe's house being worth a fraction of what they'd owned together, the casual cruelty about Felipe's lifetime of work being worthless compared to Eduardo's ambitions. That wasn't love talking. That was something else entirely. Felipe thought about the $9 million in the safe upstairs, about the power he held to change this entire dynamic with a single conversation. He could call Clara right now, tell her about the inheritance, watch her world shift. She'd see Eduardo differently then. She'd have leverage, options, security. Or would she? Would Eduardo's reaction to news of sudden wealth prove Felipe's suspicions? Or would he play it perfectly, continue the manipulation on an even grander scale? Felipe didn't know. And that uncertainty, combined with the way the evening had imploded, left him feeling more lost than he had since Maria's death. He began clearing the table, scraping uneaten food into the trash, washing dishes that no one had appreciated. His phone buzzed, a text from Clara. "I'm sorry about tonight. Eduardo is just stressed about work. He didn't mean those things." Making excuses already, rewriting reality to make the unacceptable acceptable. Felipe typed back, "We need to talk, just you and me. Coffee tomorrow?" The response took several minutes. "I can't tomorrow. Busy week. I'll call you when things calm down," which meant when Eduardo gave her permission, when she'd been sufficiently convinced that Felipe was the problem and needed to be managed rather than trusted. Felipe set his phone down and looked around his empty house. This was his reward for 26 years of sacrifice and love, isolation, distrust, and the knowledge that his daughter was walking into a trap while he held the key to her escape but couldn't use it without potentially destroying their relationship forever. The jury was watching. What would they say? That Felipe should have stayed quiet, should have smiled through Eduardo's disrespect, should have played nice for Clara's sake, or that he was right to push back, to ask hard questions, to refuse to pretend everything was fine when his instincts screamed otherwise. Felipe didn't know anymore. All he knew was that the war had officially started, lines had been drawn, and the secret he carried felt heavier with each passing hour. The inheritance sat in his safe like a loaded gun, and Felipe was the only one who knew how to fire it. The question was when, and whether pulling that trigger would save his daughter or destroy what was left of their relationship forever. You decide. Was tonight's confrontation justified, or did Felipe just make everything worse? Hold that judgment, because what happens next will test your assumptions about who the real villain of this story is. The week after the disastrous dinner stretched into 2, then 3, and Clara didn't call. She texted short messages that felt carefully composed, probably reviewed by Eduardo before being sent. Busy with work. Wedding planning is crazy. Love you, talk soon. Each one a polite deflection, a way of maintaining contact without actually connecting. Felipe tried not to push. He responded with equally brief messages, careful not to sound needy or demanding, but the silence ate at him. He'd go to bed thinking about Clara, wake up checking his phone for missed calls that never came. The house felt too quiet, too empty, like even the walls were judging him for driving his daughter away. He threw himself into volunteering at the church food bank, organizing donations and helping families who were struggling to make ends meet. It gave him purpose, distraction, but it also highlighted the cruel irony of his situation. He was helping strangers navigate poverty while sitting on knowledge of a fortune that could transform his daughter's life. The secret felt like a poison, contaminating everything. 3 weeks after the dinner, Clara finally agreed to meet him for coffee. Not at their usual spot, a diner near his house where they'd had Saturday morning breakfasts throughout her childhood. Instead, she chose a cafe in Lincoln Park, closer to her apartment, neutral territory. The message was clear: this was on her terms, in her world, not his. Felipe arrived early, ordering a simple black coffee while watching the young professionals around him tap on laptops and scroll through phones. He felt out of place in his flannel shirt and work boots, surrounded by people in business casual and athleisure, but he was used to that feeling by now. Clara came in 10 minutes late, looking tired. There were dark circles under her eyes that her makeup didn't quite hide. She hugged him briefly, a stiff gesture that lacked the warmth of their usual greetings. "Thanks for meeting me," Felipe said as they sat down. "Of course, Dad." She wrapped her hands around her latte, not meeting his eyes. "I've been meaning to call. Things have just been hectic." "How's work?" "Good. Busy. We landed a big client, so everyone's scrambling." She paused. "How have you been?" "Worried about you," Felipe said, honestly. "After the dinner, I'm sorry if I made things uncomfortable." Clara's laugh was brittle. "Uncomfortable, that's one way to put it. I shouldn't have pushed so hard about the prenup. It wasn't the right time or place." "It wasn't about the timing, Dad. It was about the implication. You basically accused Eduardo of being a gold digger in front of his mother." Felipe wanted to point out that he'd done no such thing, that he'd simply asked a reasonable question about financial planning. But he'd learned over the past few weeks that logic didn't matter when emotions were running high. "I'm sorry," he said instead. "I didn't mean to insult him or hurt you." Clara finally looked at him, and the pain in her eyes made his chest ache. "Do you know how hard it's been for me? Trying to plan a wedding while managing the 2 most important men in my life who can't stand each other?" "I don't hate Eduardo," Felipe said, even though it wasn't entirely true. "You don't respect him. You don't think he's good enough for me? You think I'm making a mistake? She wasn't asking. She was stating facts she believed to be true. I think you're rushing into something big without asking enough questions, Felipe said carefully. That's different from thinking you're making a mistake. What questions should I be asking that I haven't already asked myself 1,000,000 times? Felipe took a breath. This was the moment. He could tell her about the inheritance right here, right now. Show her the bank statements he'd brought, just in case. Let her see the $9 million and watch her world recalibrate. But something stopped him. The exhaustion in her eyes, the defensive set of her shoulders, the sense that she was barely holding herself together, and any new information might shatter her completely. How well do you know Eduardo's financial situation? He asked instead. Clara's expression hardened. We're not doing this again. Just hear me out. You've been together for 1.5 years. You're planning this expensive wedding, talking about buying property together. Do you know what his actual income is? His debts? His spending habits? Yes, Dad. I'm not an idiot. I never said you were, but money is one of the leading causes of divorce. I just want to make sure you've had honest conversations about... We've had the conversations, Clara interrupted. Eduardo is doing well. Really well. He's on track to make partner at his firm. His commissions have been incredible this year. He's financially stable and responsible. And his mother? Is she contributing to the wedding as a gift, or is it a loan that you two will owe her? Clara's coffee cup hit the table harder than necessary. Why do you always do this? Why do you always assume the worst? Because I've seen how she looks at you, Felipe said, like you're not good enough for her son, like she's doing you a favor by allowing this marriage. That's your insecurity talking, not reality. Is it? She brought her own wine glasses to my house, Clara. She made it clear she thought my home and my food and my whole life were beneath her standards. So she's a snob. So what? I'm not marrying her. But you are marrying her son, the son she raised to value money and status above everything else. Clara stood up abruptly. I can't do this. Every time I think we can have a normal conversation, you start in on Eduardo again. Sit down, Felipe said. Please, I'm not trying to fight. Then what are you trying to do? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to ruin my happiness. The accusation stung, but Felipe kept his voice level. I'm trying to protect you. That's all I've ever tried to do. By making me doubt the man I love, by planting seeds of suspicion that keep me up at night, by making me feel like I have to choose between you and him. Eduardo's the one who made that ultimatum, not me. You backed him into a corner. You questioned his intentions, his character, his love for me. What was he supposed to do? Just take it? Felipe felt his patience fraying. He was supposed to act like a man who's confident in his relationship. Instead, he lashed out and turned you against your own father. He didn't turn me against you. You did that yourself. The words hit like a punch. Felipe stared at his daughter, at the anger and hurt radiating from her, and realized he was losing this battle. Every word he said was pushing her further away, closer to Eduardo, exactly the opposite of what he wanted. I love you, he said quietly. Whatever you think of me right now, whatever you decide to do, that doesn't change. You're my daughter. You're everything to me. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Then why can't you just be happy for me? Why can't you trust that I know what I'm doing? Because... Felipe stopped. Because I'm holding $9 million that might change everything. Because I think your fiancé is a manipulative opportunist. Because I've seen this pattern before in other people's lives, and I know how it ends. Because I'm terrified of losing you to someone who doesn't deserve you. He couldn't say any of it. Because I'm your father, he said instead. And fathers worry it's what we do. Clara wiped her eyes. Well, you need to stop, or at least keep it to yourself. I can't keep having these conversations. It's tearing me apart. What do you want me to do? I want you to support my marriage. Come to the wedding, be happy for me, and stop looking for problems where there aren't any. And if I see problems, then keep them to yourself unless I ask for your opinion. She grabbed her purse. I have to go. I have a meeting with the wedding planner this afternoon. Can we do this again soon? Just coffee, just talking. Clara hesitated. Let me talk to Eduardo. He's not comfortable with me spending time with you alone right now. The admission hung in the air between them. Felipe felt something break inside his chest. He's controlling who you can see now. He's not controlling anything. He's just hurt by how you've treated him. He needs time. Clara, I have to go, Dad. I'll call you. She left before he could respond, her coffee half finished, her hug perfunctory. Felipe sat alone at the table, staring at the foam dissolving in his black coffee, feeling like he'd just failed the most important test of his life. His phone buzzed. A text from his friend Jorge, who volunteered at the food bank with him. Want to grab a beer tonight? You look like you could use one. Felipe hadn't realized Jorge had noticed his state of mind, but he was grateful for the offer. He texted back, yes, 7 o'clock. That evening, sitting in a dive bar on the south side, nursing a beer that cost $4 instead of the 12 it would have cost in Clara's neighborhood, Felipe found himself telling Jorge everything. The inheritance, the suspicions about Eduardo, the dinner disaster, the coffee conversation that had ended with his daughter admitting her fiancé controlled her social calendar. Jorge listened without interrupting, the way good friends do. When Felipe finished, Jorge took a long drink of his beer and said, "Man, that's heavy." "Tell me I'm not crazy," Felipe said. "Tell me I'm not seeing things that aren't there." Jorge shook his head. "You're not crazy. That Eduardo sounds like a piece of work. But Felipe, you got to ask yourself, what's your end game here?" End game? Yeah, say you're right about him. Say he is a gold digger. Say he is manipulating her. What are you going to do about it? You can't force her to see it. You can't make her leave him. She's got to come to that on her own. So I just watch her make a huge mistake? No. You be there for when she needs you. You keep the door open. You don't burn bridges. Jorge paused. And maybe you tell her about that inheritance before the wedding. Felipe had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it out loud made it real. If I tell her now, Eduardo will find out. And I still don't know if he already knows. So test him. Find a way to bring up money, see how he reacts. How? Jorge shrugged. You're the engineer. Figure it out. Felipe thought about it all the way home. A test. Some way to gauge Eduardo's intentions without revealing the actual inheritance. By the time he pulled into his driveway, an idea had formed. Risky, maybe manipulative in its own right, but necessary. The next morning, he called Clara. She didn't answer, so he left a voicemail. "Hi, mija. I was thinking about our conversation yesterday. You're right. I've been too hard on Eduardo. I'd like to make it up to him. Maybe you two could come over for dinner again. Just the three of us this time. I promise to be on my best behavior. I want to try to start fresh." He waited 3 days for a response. When it came, it was a text from Eduardo, not Clara. "Clara showed me your message. I appreciate the gesture. We can do dinner next Saturday, 6 p.m. No ambushes this time." The fact that Eduardo was responding instead of Clara was telling. But Felipe pushed down his irritation. This was his chance to get information, to understand what he was really dealing with. He spent the week planning. Not just the meal, though he decided to go all out. making Eduardo's favorite dishes based on things Clara had mentioned, but also preparing for the conversation he needed to have, the test he needed to run. Saturday came. Clara and Eduardo arrived exactly on time, which felt significant somehow. Clara looked nervous, her eyes darting between Felipe and Eduardo like she was waiting for the explosion. Eduardo looked guarded but civil, shaking Felipe's hand with that firm grip that felt like a test of strength. Felipe had cleaned the house thoroughly, put out fresh flowers, even bought wine that the guy at the liquor store had recommended when Felipe explained he needed something impressive. The table was set with care, and the food was his best work. They made small talk through the appetizers. Work, weather, the latest news, carefully avoiding anything controversial. But Felipe could feel the tension underneath, the anticipation of whatever was coming. Finally, as they started the main course, Felipe decided to make his move. "I've been thinking," he said, keeping his tone casual, "about what you said last time, Eduardo. About financial planning. And you were right. I haven't always been smart about money. I worked hard, but I didn't invest wisely."
Didn't build wealth? Eduardo's expression was carefully neutral. Clara looked surprised that her father was admitting any kind of fault. "But I've been talking to some people at the church," Felipe continued. "There's this financial advisor who volunteers sometimes, helps people with retirement planning, and he said something interesting."
He said that even small inheritances can make a big difference if you manage them right. He watched Eduardo's face carefully. There. Just a flicker of interest. Nothing major, but definitely attention. "Inheritances," Eduardo said. "Did you come into some money, Felipe?" "Not me," Felipe said. "But I got to thinking. Clara's grandfather, Roberto, he passed away, 6 months ago, and I realized I never asked about his estate. Whether there was anything for Clara." Clara looked confused. "Grandpa Roberto, I barely knew him. He and Mom were estranged." "I know," Felipe said. "But blood is blood, and I heard he did pretty well for himself financially. It got me wondering if maybe he left something for you, as his only grandchild." Eduardo was leaning forward now, his full attention on the conversation. "That's an interesting question. Did you ever check? Look into the will or anything?" "I wouldn't even know how," Felipe lied. "But it seems like something worth investigating. You work with contracts and legal stuff in real estate, right, Eduardo? Would you know how to find out if there was an inheritance?" "Definitely," Eduardo said, and there was an eagerness in his voice now. "I could make some calls. Look into public records. These things are usually documented somewhere." "Would you?" Felipe asked. "I'd appreciate it. I mean, it's probably nothing. Roberto and Maria didn't speak for years, but if there is something, even a small amount, it could help with the wedding costs. Take some pressure off you two." Clara was looking at Eduardo now, and Felipe could see the wheels turning in her head. "I never thought about that," she said. "Do you really think Grandpa would have left me something?" "Only one way to find out," Eduardo said. His hand found Clara's on the table, squeezing it. "I'll look into it first thing Monday morning." "That would be great," Felipe said, watching Eduardo's face. "I mean, we're probably talking about a few $1,000s at most, if anything, but every little bit helps, right?" "Absolutely," Eduardo said. "Every bit helps." They finished dinner with Eduardo in notably better spirits, talking about his recent real estate deals, his plans for the future, his goals for the next 5 years. He was charming again, the way he'd been when Felipe first met him. And Clara was relaxed, happy to see her father and fiancé getting along. After they left, Clara hugged Felipe tightly at the door. "Thank you," she whispered. "For trying." "I love you," Felipe said. That's all that matters. He watched them drive away, Eduardo's hand possessive on Clara's knee, already talking animatedly about something. Planning, probably. Calculating. Felipe had his answer. The way Eduardo's entire demeanor had changed when the possibility of inheritance came up. The eagerness to investigate. The sudden warmth toward Felipe now that he might be useful. It confirmed every suspicion Felipe had. Eduardo wasn't just interested in money, he was actively hunting for it. The question now was what to do with that knowledge. The real inheritance was $9 million, not the few thousand Felipe had suggested might exist. If Eduardo found out about the real amount, would he accelerate the wedding? Would he push Clara harder? Would he show his true colors in a way even Clara couldn't ignore? Or would he play it perfectly, continue the manipulation, marry Clara and get access to a fortune that Felipe's father-in-law had intended to protect his granddaughter with? Felipe sat in his living room, the house quiet again, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He'd set something in motion tonight, planted a seed that would either expose Eduardo or blow up in Felipe's face. The jury was deliberating. Was this a clever test or a cruel manipulation? Was Felipe protecting Clara or playing God with her life? He didn't know. But Monday morning, Eduardo would start investigating, and Felipe had maybe 72 hours to decide whether to let nature take its course or to reveal the truth and face whatever consequences came with it. The fire was burning brighter now, the evidence was mounting, and Felipe was running out of time to make the choice that would define the rest of his relationship with his daughter. What would you do? Because I'll tell you right now, what Felipe decided next will make you question everything you think you know about this story. Monday morning came and went with no word from Eduardo. Tuesday, too. By Wednesday, Felipe was starting to think maybe Eduardo had let it drop. Maybe the inheritance question wasn't as compelling as it had seemed during dinner. But Wednesday evening, just as Felipe was finishing his shift at the food bank, his phone rang. Clara. Dad, you're not going to believe this. His heart rate spiked. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. It's incredible, actually. Eduardo found something. About Grandpa Roberto's estate. Can we come over? He wants to show you what he found. Tonight. Is that okay? We're already on our way. Felipe looked around the food bank, still half full of donations that needed sorting. Give me an hour. I need to finish up here. Perfect. See you at 7. She hung up before he could ask any more questions. Felipe worked faster than he'd ever worked, organizing canned goods and sorting produce, his mind racing. Eduardo had found something. But what? Felipe knew exactly what existed in Roberto's estate because he'd been copied on all the legal documents. But what had Eduardo discovered through his own investigation? He drove home faster than he should have, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. By the time Clara and Eduardo arrived, Felipe had changed out of his work clothes and made coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he poured. Eduardo came in carrying a leather folder, looking pleased with himself. Felipe, good to see you. They settled in the living room. Eduardo opened the folder, pulling out printed pages. So I did some digging. Public records, some contacts I have in estate law. Your father-in-law was more successful than I think anyone realized. Felipe's stomach tightened. How successful? Well, I couldn't get complete access to everything, privacy laws and all that. But from what I could piece together, Roberto Mendoza's estate was valued at around $12 million at the time of his death. Clara gasped. Felipe kept his expression carefully neutral. 12 million? Give or take. The guy was smart. Tech investments in the 90s. got out before the bubble burst, diversified into real estate and bonds, very conservative, very strategic. Eduardo was clearly impressed. And here's the interesting part. I found the will summary, public record once it goes through probate. He pulled out another sheet, pointing to specific lines. The bulk of the estate went to various charities, but there's a provision here for surviving issue of the deceased's daughter, Maria Mendoza Vargas. And that's Clara. Clara was leaning forward, her eyes wide. How much? Did it say how much? Eduardo paused for effect. The document I found lists it as substantial bequest to be held in trust, which is legal speak for a lot. I'd guess anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million. Felipe's chest tightened. Eduardo had found the trail, but not the full truth. The actual amount was 9 times what he was estimating. Was this genuine ignorance, or was Eduardo downplaying to avoid seeming too eager? $1 million, Clara breathed. I can't even process that. It gets better, Eduardo said. The trust has specific conditions. It releases either on the beneficiary's 30th birthday or upon marriage, whichever comes first. And since we're getting married in 4 months... He let the implication hang. Clara looked stunned. Felipe felt sick. "Who's the trustee?" Felipe asked, even though he knew the answer. Eduardo checked the document. It lists you, actually. Felipe Vargas, named as trustee with discretionary authority over release timing. Did you know about this? This was it. The moment of truth. Felipe could lie, claim complete ignorance, buy himself more time. Or he could come clean, admit he'd known all along, face Clara's anger and Eduardo's triumph. "I received a letter," Felipe said, slowly. "From Roberto's lawyers a few months ago, around the time Clara got engaged." Clara's expression changed. "You knew? This whole time you knew I had an inheritance and you didn't tell me?" "I wasn't sure what it meant," Felipe said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "The legal language was confusing. I didn't want to get your hopes up if it turned out to be nothing." "Nothing?" Clara's voice was rising. "Dad, this is $1 million. How is that nothing?" "I thought it might be less. The letter wasn't specific about amounts." Eduardo was watching Felipe carefully, and something in his expression suggested he didn't quite believe the story. "Did the lawyers give you actual figures?" "They mentioned some numbers," Felipe admitted. "But like I said, I wasn't sure what was real and what was just legal projections." "Do you still have the letter?" Eduardo asked. "Somewhere. I'd have to look for it." "You should find it," Eduardo said, "because Clara's entitled to that money. And as her father and the trustee, you have a legal obligation to release it according to the terms of the will." The veiled threat was clear. Felipe met Eduardo's eyes and saw calculation there, ambition barely concealed behind a mask of concern for Clara's rights. Clara stood up, pacing the small living room. "I can't believe this. All this time, while I've been stressing about wedding costs and student loans and how we're going to afford a down payment on a house, there's been money sitting there, money that's mine, and you just..." "What?" "Forgot to mention it. I was trying to protect you," Felipe said. "From what?" "From having financial security, from being able to start my marriage without debt, from people who might be interested in you for the wrong reasons." The room went silent. Eduardo's expression hardened. Clara's face flushed with anger. "You mean Eduardo?" Clara said flatly. "You didn't tell me because you thought Eduardo was after my money." "I didn't know what to think," Felipe said. "You two had just gotten engaged. I barely knew him. The timing seemed..." "Convenient for your paranoia," Eduardo finished. "Jesus, Felipe, you really can't help yourself, can you? Even when you're supposedly trying to make peace, you're scheming in the background. That's not fair, Felipe started. Fair? Clara's voice cracked. You want to talk about fair? You've been sitting on information about my inheritance for months, while I've been drowning in student loan payments and credit card debt from trying to keep up with Eduardo's lifestyle, while we've been arguing about wedding budgets and whether we can afford the venue we want. You let me struggle, let me stress, because you decided unilaterally that I couldn't be trusted with my own money. It wasn't about trust, Felipe said desperately. It was about timing, about making sure Eduardo didn't find out, Clara interrupted. About controlling my life from the shadows. God, Dad, do you hear yourself? This is exactly what I was afraid of. You can't let me go. You can't let me make my own decisions. You have to manipulate everything to match your version of what's best for me. Eduardo stood, putting his arm around Clara. We should go. You're upset, and he's just going to keep making excuses. Wait, Felipe said. Clara, please, let's talk about this. Talk about what? Tears were streaming down her face now. About how you've been lying to me. About how you think so little of my judgment that you'd hide $1 million inheritance because you don't like my fiancé. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Dad? Explain it to me. Make me understand how this was anything other than a massive betrayal of my trust. Felipe looked at his daughter, at the pain and anger radiating from her, and knew that anything he said would be wrong. The truth was complicated, that he'd been protecting her from what he feared was a predator, that the inheritance was actually much larger than Eduardo had discovered, that his instincts about Eduardo had only been confirmed by tonight's conversation. But he couldn't say any of that without making things worse. I'm sorry, he said quietly. You're right. I should have told you immediately I made a mistake. A mistake? Eduardo's voice was sharp. This wasn't a mistake. This was calculated. You knew exactly what you were doing. Eduardo, please, Clara said. Let me handle this. No, he needs to hear this. He needs to understand that he can't just apologize and make this go away. He's been lying to you, manipulating you, trying to control your life. And the fact that he's only admitting it now, after I found out independently, tells you everything you need to know about his character. Don't you dare lecture me about character, Felipe said, his own anger finally breaking through. You've been sniffing around for money since the moment you found out there might be an inheritance. The change in your attitude was instantaneous. I see you, Eduardo. I see exactly what you are. And what am I? Eduardo stepped forward, his body language aggressive. A man who wants the best for his future wife? Someone who thinks she deserves to have what's legally hers? Or are you going to keep pretending this is about something else? It's about Clara, Felipe said. It's always been about Clara. No, Eduardo said. It's about you, your ego, your need to be the hero, your inability to accept that Clara doesn't need you to protect her anymore. Clara was crying harder now, her hands over her face. Felipe wanted to go to her, to comfort her the way he had when she was a child. But Eduardo's arm was around her shoulders, creating a physical barrier. We're leaving, Eduardo said. And Clara, you need to decide. Your father just admitted he's been lying to you for months about something huge, something that affects your entire financial future. Are you really going to let that slide? Clara lowered her hands. Her eyes, when they met Felipe's, were cold in a way he'd never seen before. I need the letter from the lawyers and any other documents you have about the inheritance tonight. Clara, it's late. Can we please talk about this tomorrow when everyone's calmer? Tonight, Dad, or I'll have Eduardo's lawyer contact you tomorrow. Your choice. Felipe felt everything slipping away. The relationship he'd spent 26 years building, the trust he'd thought was unshakable, the bond between father and daughter that was supposed to survive anything. All of it crumbling because he'd tried to protect her from a threat she refused to see. "I'll get them," he said. He went upstairs, his legs heavy, and opened the safe. The bank statements showing the true amount. The letters from the lawyers. The trust documents with all the details Eduardo hadn't found yet. He paused, considering whether to hold back the information about the actual dollar amount. But Clara had asked for everything, and if he held back now, she'd never forgive him. He brought it all downstairs and handed the folder to Clara. She took it without looking at him. "Thank you," she said formally, like he was a stranger doing her a minor favor. Eduardo took the folder from her, flipping it open. Felipe watched his face as he scanned the first page, saw the moment Eduardo's eyes hit the actual dollar figure, the number 9 million. The realization that he'd been off by a factor of 9 in his estimate. Eduardo's expression went carefully blank, but Felipe saw the flash of greed, of triumph, of pure mercenary calculation before the mask came down. And in that moment, Felipe knew with absolute certainty that every fear, every suspicion, every protective instinct had been right. But Clara was looking at the papers now too, her hand over her mouth. 9 million? It's $9 million. That's what the documents say, Felipe confirmed. And you knew the whole time it was this much. Yes. She looked up at him, and the betrayal in her eyes was like a knife. "Get out," she whispered. "What?" "Get out. I can't look at you right now. I can't be in the same room with you. Clara, this is my house. Then we'll leave. Eduardo, let's go. I can't breathe in here." Eduardo guided her toward the door, his hand on her back, possessive and protective and victorious all at once. At the threshold, he turned back to Felipe. "You know what the ironic thing is?" Eduardo said. "If you'd just told her from the beginning, if you'd trusted her, she probably would have consulted you about everything, asked for your advice, valued your opinion. But now you've proven you can't be trusted. So when we get married, and that money releases, we'll handle it ourselves. Without your input, without your interference. You did this to yourself, Felipe. You pushed her away by trying too hard to hold on." Then they were gone, the door closing with a finality that echoed through the empty house. Felipe stood in his living room, surrounded by the life he'd built, the memories he'd made, the home that suddenly felt like a mausoleum. His phone buzzed, a text from Clara. "Don't contact me unless I reach out first. I need time to process this. And Dad, you broke something tonight. I don't know if it can be fixed." Felipe sat down heavily on the couch. He'd played his hand and lost. Everything he'd feared had come to pass, but instead of Clara seeing Eduardo's true nature, she'd turned her anger entirely on Felipe. He was the villain of this story now. The lying, manipulative father who'd hidden a $9 million inheritance to maintain control over his daughter. And Eduardo? Eduardo was the hero, the man who'd uncovered the truth, who'd defended Clara's rights, who'd stood by her against her father's deception. Felipe had lost, completely and utterly. And the worst part was that even now, even with the evidence of Eduardo's greed clear in that momentary expression, Clara wouldn't see it. Love and anger had made her blind. The inheritance was real. The wedding was 4 months away. And when Clara married Eduardo, the $9 million would release to a man who'd already shown he was primarily interested in the money, not the woman. Felipe had tried to protect his daughter, and instead had driven her straight into the arms of exactly what he'd feared. And now, with their relationship in ruins, He had no way to stop it. The jury was reaching a verdict, but which verdict? That Felipe was a controlling liar who got what he deserved? Or that he was a father proven right too late, watching helplessly as the tragedy he'd predicted unfolded? You decide. Because what happens next will either prove Felipe was right all along, or show that he destroyed everything for nothing. And honestly, I'm not sure which possibility is worse. The next 3 weeks were the loneliest of Felipe's life. Clara didn't call, didn't text, didn't respond to his messages. He tried not to contact her too often, not wanting to seem desperate or controlling, but the silence was crushing. He'd go to the food bank and find himself staring at his phone between tasks, hoping for a message that never came. He'd cook dinner for one and remember all the meals he'd shared with Clara, the running commentary she'd provide about her day, her laugh at his dad jokes, the easy comfort of their companionship. Jorge checked in regularly, taking Felipe out for beers and letting him vent about the situation. "Give her time," Jorge would say. "She's processing. She'll come around." But Felipe wasn't sure. He'd broken something fundamental: trust. And trust, once shattered, was hard to rebuild. He learned about the wedding plans through social media, which felt like a special kind of torture. Clara's Instagram showed dress shopping with friends, venue tours, cake tastings. Eduardo featured prominently in all of it, his arm around her, his comments full of heart emojis and promises of forever. The posts got hundreds of likes, dozens of comments congratulating them. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. Felipe wasn't invited to any of it. He existed in the negative space, the absence, the father-shaped hole in the preparations. Then, 4 weeks after the confrontation, his phone rang at 2 in the morning. Felipe jerked awake, his heart hammering. Late-night calls were never good news. "Hello? Dad?" Clara's voice was small, broken. "Can you come get me?" Felipe was out of bed before she finished the sentence. "Where are you?" "Eduardo's apartment. I can't drive right now. I'm not okay." "I'm on my way. 20 minutes. Stay on the phone with me." He drove through the empty streets of Chicago, listening to Clara's ragged breathing on the other end of the line. She wasn't talking, wasn't explaining, just crying quietly. Every instinct Felipe had was screaming that something terrible had happened. Eduardo's building was in a wealthy neighborhood, all glass and steel and pretension. Felipe double-parked in front, hazards flashing, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. Clara was waiting in the hallway, a bag at her feet, her makeup smeared, wearing pajamas and a coat thrown over them. "Baby girl," Felipe breathed, and she collapsed into his arms. He got her to the car, loaded her bag, drove back to his house while she curled in the passenger seat and shook. He didn't ask questions. That could wait. Right now, she just needed to be safe. At home, he made her tea while she sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd had so many conversations over the years. She wrapped her hands around the mug, but didn't drink, just stared at the steam rising. "Do you want to talk about it?" Felipe asked gently. Clara took a shuddering breath. He showed me his plan. "What plan?" "For the money, the inheritance." He had it all mapped out. Investments, real estate purchases, a 5-year portfolio strategy. He'd been working on it since the night we left here with the documents. 3 weeks, Dad. 3 weeks of detailed financial planning about what to do with my inheritance. Felipe's hands clenched. "Did he consult you about any of it?" "That's the thing. He presented it like it was a done deal, like I'd just sign off on whatever he decided. When I questioned one of the investments,
Asked why we'd put so much into this commercial property development he got. She paused, swallowing hard. He got angry. Said I didn't understand finance, that I should trust him because he's the expert. What did you say? I said it was my money and I wanted to be part of the decisions. And he said, her voice broke. He said that once we were married, it would be our money.
And I needed to stop being selfish about it. That a wife trusts her husband's judgment. Felipe felt rage burning in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. What happened then? We fought, really fought. He said things. She closed her eyes. He said that I was being ungrateful, that he'd elevated me, given me access to a life I never could have had on my own, that my marketing job was basically a hobby compared to his real career, that without him, I'd just waste the inheritance on nothing. Jesus, Clara. And then I asked him straight out, would you still want to marry me if there was no inheritance? Felipe held his breath. What did he say? He said that was a stupid hypothetical, that the inheritance exists, so why does it matter? But Dad, the way he said it, the way he couldn't just say yes. I saw it. Everything you've been trying to tell me, I finally saw it. She was crying again, tears streaming down her face. I've been so stupid, so blind. You tried to warn me, and I called you controlling. I accused you of lying when you were just trying to protect me. You weren't stupid, Felipe said, moving to sit beside her. You were in love. Love makes us want to believe the best in people. But the signs were there, all of them. The way he talked about money constantly, the way he measured everything in terms of status and success, the way he treated you like you were less than because you didn't have wealth, the way his mother looked down on us. I ignored all of it because I wanted so badly to believe he loved me for me. Maybe part of him does, Felipe offered, even though he didn't believe it. Clara shook her head. No, tonight made it clear. When I told him I wasn't comfortable with his plan, when I said I needed time to think about what to do with the inheritance, he said maybe we should postpone the wedding. He actually said that. Postpone the wedding until I came to my senses about the money. He threatened to call off the wedding if you didn't let him manage the inheritance. Basically, and then I realized the only reason he proposed was because he found out I was Roberto's granddaughter. The timeline matches. He met me through work, yes. But he didn't ask me out until after he'd done a background check for a client that included financial records. What if he saw something then? What if this whole relationship has been about positioning himself for this money? Felipe wanted to say that was paranoid thinking, that she was catastrophizing. But honestly, he'd wondered the same thing himself. I don't know, he said, but it doesn't matter now. What matters is that you saw the truth and you got out. I didn't even officially break up with him. I just grabbed my stuff and called you. He was still yelling about the money when I left. Not don't go or I love you. Just, you're making a huge mistake and you'll regret this. Good, Felipe said. Let him yell. You're safe here. Clara leaned against him, and Felipe wrapped his arms around his daughter the way he had when she was small and the world seemed too big and scary. I'm so sorry, Dad, for everything I said, for not trusting you, for choosing him over you. You don't have to apologize. You were trying to build your own life. That's what you're supposed to do. But I should have listened. All those questions you asked, all those concerns you raised, you were right about everything. Felipe kissed the top of her head. I wish I'd been wrong. They sat like that for a long time, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sniffle from Clara. Finally, she pulled back. The wedding, she said. I have to cancel everything. The venue, the photographer, the caterer. Oh, God. The deposits. We'll handle it, Felipe said. Tomorrow. Tonight, You just rest. What am I going to tell people? The truth. That you realized it wasn't right, and you're calling it off. Anyone who loves you will understand. His mother is going to destroy me on social media. Let her. Her opinion doesn't matter. Clara nodded, but Felipe could see the anxiety in her eyes. This was going to be hard, public, messy, embarrassing, but it was better than the alternative, marrying a man who saw her as a means to wealth rather than a partner to cherish. Can I stay here for a while? Clara asked. I can't go back to my apartment right now. Eduardo has a key, and I just... Of course, your room is still your room. You can stay as long as you need. Thank you, Daddy. The use of the childhood term made Felipe's eyes sting. His little girl, heartbroken and lost, turning to him for safety. It was what he'd always wanted, to protect her, to be her refuge, but not like this. Never like this. The next morning, Clara woke to 17 missed calls from Eduardo and 43 text messages ranging from apologetic to angry to threatening. Felipe watched her scroll through them, her face hardening with each one. He's saying I'm being irrational, she said, that I'm throwing away our future over a stupid argument, that I'm going to regret this when I'm alone and broke. Block him, Felipe said. You don't need to read that. She did, but not before screenshotting several messages. Evidence, she said, in case he tries to spin this differently in public. Over the next few days, the calls to cancel the wedding were brutal. The venue refused to refund the deposit. The photographer was sympathetic but firm about their cancellation policy. The caterer, dress shop, florist, DJ, everyone had penalties and fees. By Felipe's calculation, Clara was going to lose close to $20,000 in non-refundable deposits and cancellation fees. It's okay, he told her, when she broke down crying over the numbers. It's just money. You're worth more than any of it. But the financial hit was significant, especially combined with her existing student loans and credit card debt. The inheritance would help, but Clara didn't want to touch it yet. I need to figure out what I actually want, she said, without Eduardo in my ear telling me what to do with it. Maybe I'll pay off my debts, invest the rest conservatively. Or maybe I'll take some time off work, figure out what I actually want to do with my life instead of just grinding at a job I don't love. Whatever you decide, Felipe said. I'm here, not to control it or tell you what to do, just to support you. I know, and I'm sorry I ever doubted that. The social media fallout was as bad as Clara had predicted. Eduardo's post was masterful in its manipulation. Heartbroken to announce that Clara and I have decided to postpone our wedding. Sometimes people aren't ready for the kind of commitment marriage requires. I'll always care about her, but I have to respect her choice to walk away, wishing her the best. He'd made it sound like she was the one with cold feet, the one who couldn't commit, neatly avoiding any mention of the inheritance or the fight that had precipitated the breakup. Catalina's comments on the post were even worse, talking about how some people couldn't handle success and luxury, how Eduardo had tried his best, but you can't change someone who doesn't want to grow. Clara wanted to respond to set the record straight, but Felipe counseled against it. Don't engage. The people who matter know the truth. Everyone else will believe what they want to believe, regardless. Jorge came by with beer and pizza, offering his perspective as someone who'd been divorced twice. You dodged a bullet the size of a missile, he told Clara. I've seen this kind of guy before. Charming, successful, knows all the right things to say, but underneath it's all about control and money. You would have been miserable. I feel so stupid, though, Clara said, like I should have seen it sooner. Love makes fools of us all, Jorge said. The smart ones figure it out before the wedding instead of after. You're smart. Over the following weeks, Clara slowly rebuilt her life. She changed the locks on her apartment after Eduardo used his key to let himself in one night, claiming he just wanted to talk. She blocked his number after the texts turned from apologetic to nasty. She started seeing a therapist to process the relationship and her complicated feelings about the inheritance. And, slowly, her relationship with Felipe healed. They fell back into their old rhythm, Sunday dinners, phone calls during the week, sharing the small moments of daily life. Clara was more careful now, more aware of manipulation tactics, more willing to listen when Felipe raised concerns. But she was also more independent, more confident in her own judgment, having learned from the Eduardo experience. The inheritance sat untouched while Clara figured out her next steps. She consulted with financial advisors, read books on investment strategy, took a financial literacy course online. She wasn't going to make decisions about that kind of money without being fully educated. 6 months after the breakup, Clara mentioned casually over dinner that Eduardo had gotten engaged to someone else. One of his clients, she said. Apparently her family owns a chain of hotels. He posted about it on Instagram. How does that make you feel? Felipe asked. Clara considered. Relieved mostly. It confirms that it was never really about me. He was looking for wealth, and I happened to be a convenient option until I wasn't cooperative enough. Now he's found someone else who fits his criteria. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I'm not. I mean, it sucked at the time, but I learned a lot. About what I want, what I won't tolerate, how to spot red flags. The next person I date, I'll be smarter about. The next person you date will be lucky to have you, Felipe said. Clara smiled. Thanks, Dad. And thank you for being right. Even when I didn't want to hear it. I wish I'd been wrong. But you weren't, and you tried to protect me even though it cost you our relationship for a while. That took courage. Felipe thought about all the sleepless nights, all the second-guessing, all the fear that he was making the wrong choice by hiding the inheritance. I almost lost you, he said. That was the worst part. Not Eduardo or the money or any of it. Just the thought of losing my daughter. You didn't lose me. I lost my way for a bit, but you were always there, waiting for me to find my way back. They clinked their water glasses together, a toast to survival, to lessons learned the hard way, to the resilience of the bond between father and daughter. But this story isn't over yet, because the question still remains. Was Felipe right to hide the inheritance in the first place? Did his deception protect Clara, or did it just delay the inevitable and damage their relationship in the process? And what about the money itself? Is $9 million a blessing or a curse for a young woman trying to figure out her life? Here's where you come in. The jury. Because the aftermath is one thing, but the original choice, to hide or to reveal, that's what we need to verdict on. Was Felipe a protective father or a controlling manipulator?
Was his instinct right, even if his methods were questionable? Hold that thought. Because before you render your verdict, there's one more layer to this story. One more piece of information that might change everything you think you know. And it's coming right now, 8 months after the breakup.
Clara used a portion of the inheritance to make a down payment on a modest condo in a neighborhood she loved. Not Lincoln Park, not the wealthy areas Eduardo had pushed her toward, but a comfortable middle-class area with good coffee shops and a sense of community. She decorated it herself, furnished it with pieces that reflected her taste rather than trying to impress anyone. She also quit her marketing job and went back to school, pursuing a master's degree in education. I think I want to teach, she told Felipe. Like Mom did, help kids who are struggling, make a difference that actually matters. The inheritance means I can do that without drowning in more debt. Felipe had never been prouder, but the story took an unexpected turn when Clara's lawyer called with news about the trust. There was a provision Felipe hadn't paid much attention to, buried in the legal language. If Clara didn't marry before age 30, the trust would remain under Felipe's discretion until that birthday. But there was a clause: if Clara married and subsequently divorced within 2 years, the marriage would be considered null for purposes of trust distribution, and the money would revert to trustee control until age 30. In other words, if Clara had married Eduardo and then divorced him within 2 years, which, given what had transpired, seemed almost certain, she would have lost access to the inheritance for another 4 years. And in a divorce, Eduardo might have had legal grounds to claim a portion of it depending on how it was structured. Roberto Mendoza, it turned out, had anticipated exactly this scenario. A gold digger targeting his granddaughter, a hasty marriage motivated by wealth. He'd built in safeguards that Felipe hadn't fully understood when he'd first received the trust documents. When Clara learned this, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "So Grandpa Roberto was protecting me from beyond the grave, and you were protecting me in the present. Everyone was trying to keep me safe except me." "You were protecting yourself too," Felipe said, "by trusting your instincts when they finally broke through the manipulation." "But if I'd married him..." "God, Dad, if I'd married him and then divorced him, I would have been stuck in legal battles, potentially lost some of the money, and been trapped without access to the inheritance for years while trying to rebuild my life." "But you didn't marry him because you made me suspicious enough to look closer, because you cared enough to risk our relationship to protect me, because you saw what I couldn't see." Felipe shook his head. "You saw it too, eventually. I couldn't stand by and watch without at least trying." "You did more than try. You succeeded. Even when I hated you for it, even when I thought you were the villain, you were actually the hero of this story." "I'm not a hero. I'm just a dad who loves his daughter. That's what makes you a hero." They sat with that for a while, the weight of what could have been settling around them. Now here's where it gets interesting, because you could argue that Felipe's decision to hide the inheritance was vindicated by the outcome. Clara didn't marry Eduardo, didn't lose her money, didn't end up in a toxic marriage. The deception worked, in a sense. But you could also argue that the deception caused Clara unnecessary pain, damaged their relationship for months, and that the truth would have come out eventually anyway through Eduardo's own greed. Maybe Clara would have seen his true nature sooner if Felipe had been honest from the start. Maybe the lies were never necessary. Or maybe, and this is the really complicated part, both things are true. Felipe's deception was wrong and damaging, and it protected Clara from a worse fate. The ends don't justify the means, but the means did achieve the desired end. Where does that leave us morally? The jury has all the evidence now. Felipe's fear, Eduardo's greed, Clara's heartbreak, the inheritance that both solved and created problems, the trust provision that suggests Roberto Mendoza understood human nature better than anyone gave him credit for. So what's your verdict? Was Felipe right or wrong to hide the inheritance? Was Eduardo the villain, or just an ambitious man who got a bad rap? Was Clara a victim of manipulation or a willing participant who needed to learn a hard lesson? Is generational wealth a blessing or a curse? And what does this story tell us about trust, protection, and the complicated love between parents and children? I'll let you be the judge, because I can see arguments on all sides, and I genuinely don't know if there's a clear right answer here. Maybe that's the point. Maybe life is messy and complicated, and sometimes the best we can do is act from love and hope it's enough. But before you render your final verdict, let me give you the tools to understand what you just witnessed. Let's break down the psychology that was at play here, the manipulation tactics that almost worked, and the red flags that could help you or someone you love avoid the same trap. Because this isn't just Clara's story. It's a pattern that plays out in relationships every single day. And understanding it might be the difference between heartbreak and escape. You've heard the story, you know the outcome, but do you know exactly what happened to your brain while you were listening? Do you understand the specific psychological weapon that Eduardo deployed against Clara, and why it was so effective? Because if you've ever felt that same confusion in your own life,
If you've ever second-guessed yourself in a relationship, if you've ever wondered why you couldn't see what everyone else saw, you need to understand this. This isn't a textbook lecture. This is a forensic psychological autopsy. We're going back through the crime scene with new eyes, looking for the clues most people missed. And I promise you, when we're done,
you'll never look at a relationship the same way again. So here's what really happened. The machinery underneath the drama. The three-step process that turned a confident, independent woman into someone who doubted her own father's love. Step 1. Love bombing. Remember how Eduardo came on strong from the start? The expensive dates, the constant attention, the rapid escalation from casual dating to serious relationship. That wasn't passion, that was strategy. Love bombing is a manipulation tactic where someone overwhelms you with affection and grand gestures to create intense emotional dependency quickly. It bypasses your rational mind and gets you addicted to the high of being desired, wanted, chosen. Clara experienced this in the first 3 months. Eduardo swept her off her feet, made her feel special, created a whirlwind romance that felt like destiny. And critically, he did it fast enough that she didn't have time to evaluate whether the relationship was actually healthy. By the time any red flags appeared, she was already emotionally invested, already attached, already planning a future with him. Step 2. Isolation disguised as intimacy. Now go back to the dinner at Felipe's house, the first one where things went wrong. Remember how Eduardo positioned it? You have to decide whose side you're on, and that's not a request for loyalty, that's an isolation tactic. Eduardo was systematically separating Clara from her support system, specifically her father, the person most likely to see through his act. He did it subtly, never a direct "don't see your father." Instead, it was, "he doesn't respect us, he makes you stressed. We need to protect our relationship from negative influences." Every conversation was reframed to position Felipe as the problem and Eduardo as the solution. And when Clara pushed back, Eduardo didn't back down. He escalated, making his displeasure clear, creating emotional consequences for Clara, maintaining her independent relationships. This is textbook. Abusers and manipulators don't say, "I'm going to cut you off from everyone who loves you." They say, "Everyone who truly loves you will support our happiness." And then they define support as complete agreement with whatever they want. Remember when Clara mentioned that Eduardo wasn't comfortable with her spending time alone with Felipe? That's not jealousy or insecurity, that's control. Eduardo needed Clara isolated so she'd have no outside perspective to contrast against his version of reality. Step 3. Gaslighting about money and worth. This is where it gets really insidious. Go back to that dinner confrontation. Eduardo didn't just get angry about the prenup question, he attacked Felipe's entire life. You worked 40 years and have what to show for it? A mortgage you haven't paid off and a retirement that barely covers your expenses. That wasn't defensiveness. That was a calculated assault on Felipe's credibility. By establishing that Felipe was financially unsuccessful, Eduardo was implying that Felipe's opinions about money and relationships were worthless. It's a form of gaslighting, making someone doubt their perceptions by undermining their authority to have those perceptions. And it worked on Clara, at least initially. She started questioning whether her father's concerns were legitimate or just the jealousy of a man who'd never achieved wealth. Eduardo reframed protective instinct as inadequacy. But here's what most people miss about gaslighting. It's not just lying, it's creating an alternative reality where the liar's version of events is more credible than the victim's lived experience. Eduardo did this constantly. When Clara expressed concern about wedding costs, he made it about her lack of ambition. When she questioned his financial plan for the inheritance, he made it about her lack of sophistication. Every time she trusted her own judgment, he provided an explanation for why her judgment was flawed. The weapon had 3 parts: love bombing to create dependency, isolation to remove competing perspectives, and gaslighting to make Clara doubt her own mind. Together, they form what psychologists call a trauma bond. Clara wasn't just in love with Eduardo. She was psychologically trapped in a cycle where leaving felt harder than staying, where his approval felt necessary for her self-worth, where his version of reality seemed more reliable than her own. Now let's talk about the impact, because understanding the weapon is only half the battle. You need to understand why Clara couldn't just walk away, even when the red flags were everywhere. This is called cognitive dissonance, and it's the real villain of this story. Clara's brain was trying to hold 2 contradictory beliefs simultaneously. I love Eduardo and he loves me, and Eduardo is showing signs of being manipulative and money-focused. Those 2 beliefs can't coexist comfortably. So Clara's brain had to resolve the dissonance. She had 2 options. Option 1, accept that Eduardo might not be who she thought he was, which would mean admitting she'd made a terrible mistake, wasted time and emotion, and was potentially about to marry the wrong person. That option is psychologically devastating. It requires acknowledging that your judgment was wrong, your instincts failed you, and your dream future is built on sand. Option 2, reframe the evidence to make Eduardo's behavior acceptable. Dad's just overprotective. Eduardo's not money-focused, he's financially responsible. The red flags aren't really red flags, they're just cultural differences or stress from wedding planning. This option lets Clara keep her dream intact, maintain her self-image as someone who makes good decisions, and avoid the pain of admitting error. Which option do you think her brain preferred? Go back to the moment when Clara defended Eduardo to Felipe. He's not like his mother. He loves me for me. You don't know him like I do. Those weren't statements of fact. Those were Clara's brain desperately trying to resolve cognitive dissonance by rewriting reality. And here's the truly insidious part. The more Clara defended Eduardo, the harder it became to change her mind. Every time she chose option 2, reframe rather than reevaluate, she increased her investment in that narrative. She doubled down, tripled down, until admitting the truth would mean admitting she'd been lying to herself for months. This is why victims of manipulation often can't see what's obvious to everyone else. It's not stupidity, it's not weakness, it's the brain's natural defense mechanism against cognitive dissonance. The more you invest in a relationship, the more painful it becomes to admit that investment was misplaced. But there's another layer here. Intermittent reinforcement. Eduardo wasn't awful all the time. Remember the moments where he was charming, affectionate, the perfect partner. Those weren't accidents, they were strategically timed rewards that kept Clara hooked. Psychologists have proven that intermittent reinforcement, reward that comes unpredictably rather than consistently, creates stronger behavioral conditioning than consistent reward. It's why slot machines are addictive. You don't know when the next win is coming, so you keep playing hoping the next pull will be the jackpot. Eduardo was Clara's slot machine. Most of the time, he was controlling, dismissive, focused on money, but occasionally he'd be sweet, romantic, attentive. And Clara's brain learned to chase those moments, to work for them, to believe that if she just tried hard enough, if she was understanding enough, if she stopped listening to her father's concerns, Eduardo would be that perfect partner all the time. This is trauma bonding, the cycle of tension, explosion, and reconciliation that keeps people trapped in toxic relationships. Clara wasn't staying with Eduardo despite his red flags. She was staying because her brain had been conditioned to crave the high of his approval, to work for the intermittent reward of his affection. Now take the most frustrating decision Clara made, defending Eduardo after the inheritance reveal, choosing him over Felipe initially. The audience wants to scream, "Don't do it!" But Clara's brain forced her to do it. Here's why. At that moment, Clara was experiencing massive cognitive dissonance. Her father, whom she loved and trusted for 26 years, had lied to her about something huge. Her fiancé, whom she loved and was planning to marry, had just been caught being primarily interested in money. Her brain needed to make sense of these contradictory realities. The path of least resistance was to blame Felipe. Because Felipe admitted wrongdoing, he acknowledged hiding the inheritance. Eduardo, on the other hand, reframed his behavior as justified concern for Clara's rights. Felipe made himself the villain by being honest about his deception. Eduardo made himself the hero by positioning his greed as advocacy. Clara's brain, already conditioned by months of Eduardo's manipulation, naturally gravitated toward the narrative that caused less dissonance. Dad is controlling and lied to protect his power. Eduardo is standing up for my rights and our future. It wasn't logic. It was survival instinct. Clara's brain was protecting her from the psychological devastation of admitting she'd nearly married a man who saw her as a walking bank account. But here's the crucial part. The reason this story has a different ending than many similar ones. Clara's cognitive dissonance finally broke when Eduardo showed his true colors too blatantly. The financial plan he'd created without her input, the anger when she questioned it, the casual cruelty about her career being a hobby, the immediate suggestion to postpone the wedding when she didn't cooperate with his money management plan. That was too much even for a brain desperate to maintain the fantasy. The dissonance became unbearable, and Clara's brain finally chose option one, reevaluate rather than reframe. She admitted Eduardo was who Felipe had been saying he was all along, and yes, that admission was psychologically devastating. But it was also liberating. When you combine Eduardo's manipulation tactics with Clara's cognitive dissonance, you don't get a simple story of a woman being fooled. You get a hostage situation. Eduardo wasn't just dating Clara. He was psychologically imprisoning her, using weapons most people don't recognize until it's too late. And Felipe? Felipe recognized the weapons. Maybe not by name, maybe not with clinical precision, but he saw the pattern. He saw his daughter being isolated, gaslit, conditioned, and he made a choice that most people would consider controversial. He withheld information to protect her from making a decision under psychological duress. Was that right? Was that wrong? Here's where it gets philosophically complex. On one hand, Felipe violated Clara's autonomy. The inheritance was hers. She had a right to know. By hiding it, Felipe made himself the arbiter of when she was ready for that information, which is paternalistic at best, controlling at worst. On the other hand, Clara wasn't operating with free will when she was under Eduardo's influence. The decision to marry Eduardo wasn't being made by the real Clara. It was being made by a version of Clara whose judgment was compromised by manipulation tactics designed specifically to bypass rational thought. So was Felipe protecting Clara's autonomy by waiting until she could think clearly? Or was he violating it by deciding when she was capable of clear thought? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And I think that's the point of this story. Sometimes there are no good options, only less bad ones. Sometimes love requires making choices that look like control, and sometimes protection requires deception. What I do know is this. If you've ever felt the way Clara felt, torn between someone you love and people who warn you about that person, defensive about a relationship, even when you know something's wrong, unable to explain why you stay, despite red flags. You weren't weak. You weren't stupid. You were experiencing a well-documented psychological phenomenon that happens to smart, strong, capable people every single day. The question isn't, how could Clara not see it? The question is, how did Clara manage to see it before it was too late? Because most people don't. Most people marry the Eduardo. And then the real nightmare begins. So that's the psychological decoder. The weapon was manipulation through love bombing, isolation, and gaslighting. The impact was cognitive dissonance and trauma bonding. And the synthesis was a relationship that looked like love, but functioned like a trap. Now you have the vocabulary to explain why you felt what you felt while listening to this story. You have the framework to recognize these patterns in your own life or in the lives of people you care about. And hopefully, you have the knowledge to avoid becoming Clara, or to escape if you already are. But knowledge isn't enough. You need to be able to spot these patterns in real time in your own relationships before they've progressed to the point of disaster. So let's talk about the evidence list, the 5 red flags that if you see them, almost mathematically guarantee a bad ending. We usually only see red flags in the rearview mirror when it's too late to avoid the crash. But what if you could recognize them in real time? What if you had a checklist that if more than 2 items are checked, tells you to run? That's what this is. Not a guarantee. Human behavior is too complex for certainties. But a pattern recognition tool honed from thousands of stories just like Clara's. If you see these 5 signs, the ending is almost mathematically guaranteed. The only question is whether you'll recognize them in time. Flag number 1. The subtle beginning. Love bombing disguised as romance. At the beginning of Clara's story, Eduardo swept her off her feet. Expensive dinners, constant attention, rapid escalation from casual to serious. It looked like passion, like destiny, like the kind of love story people write songs about. It was actually love bombing, a manipulation tactic designed to create intense emotional dependency before you have time to evaluate whether the relationship is healthy. Here's how to tell the difference between genuine enthusiasm and love bombing. Genuine enthusiasm respects your pace. Love bombing overwhelms your pace. A healthy partner says, "I'm excited about you. Let's see where this goes." A love bomber says, "I've never felt this way before. You're my soulmate. Let's move in together after 6 weeks." A healthy partner integrates you into their existing life. A love bomber creates a bubble where only the 2 of you exist, where the intensity of the relationship eclipses everything else. A healthy partner is consistent. A love bomber is excessive, showering you with gifts and attention and proclamations of love that feel too big, too soon, too perfect. The test is simple. If someone is putting you on a pedestal in the first few months, ask yourself why. What are they getting from idealizing you? What are you expected to provide in return for being the most amazing person they've ever met? Because here's the dark secret of love bombing. It's a loan, not a gift. All that excessive attention and affection comes with an unspoken debt. Later, when you express doubt or set a boundary or disagree, the love bomber will remind you of everything they've done for you. How could you question them after they've been so generous, so devoted, so loving. If you see this pattern, overwhelming intensity at the start, followed by expectations of absolute loyalty and agreement, pause. Step back. Ask yourself, if this person disappeared tomorrow, would I feel relieved or devastated? If the answer is relieved, you already know the truth. Flag number 2, the boundary violation, when no gets negotiated away. Go back to Clara's story. Every time she expressed a limit or a concern, Eduardo found a way to reframe it. Her worry about wedding costs became her lack of ambition. Her question about the prenup became her lack of trust. Her desire to be consulted about the inheritance plan became her lack of financial sophistication. This is boundary erosion, and it's one of the best predictors of future behavior because it shows you exactly how someone will treat your autonomy when it conflicts with their desires. A boundary violation doesn't look like someone ignoring your no. That's too obvious. It looks like someone explaining why your no is actually a maybe if you just understood the situation better. You said you're not comfortable with this? Well, let me explain why you should be comfortable. You said you need space, but I need to talk right now, so your need for space is actually you avoiding the real issue. You said this is important to you. Well, it's not logical. So let's discuss the logical thing to do instead. The pattern is, your stated boundary is treated as a starting point for negotiation rather than a fact to be respected. Here's the test. The next time you set a boundary with someone, I need time to think about this. I'm not comfortable with that. This is important to me. Watch how they respond. A healthy response. Okay, I understand. Let me know when you're ready to talk. They might be disappointed, but they respect your autonomy. An unhealthy response. But why? Followed by attempts to logic you out of your feelings. That doesn't make sense. You're being irrational. If you really loved me, you wouldn't need space right now. The ultimate test. If saying no to someone results in them being angry, sullen, punishing, or accusatory, that person doesn't respect your boundaries, full stop. And if you can't say no without extensive justification and emotional labor to manage their reaction, you're not in a relationship. You're in a hostage negotiation. Clara couldn't say no to Eduardo about the financial plan without him questioning her intelligence and threatening the relationship. That's not a partner, that's a controller. If you see this flag, the question to ask is, when was the last time this person accepted a no from me without trying to change my mind? If you can't remember, you're not in a partnership. You're in a dictatorship where you occasionally get to voice opinion before being overruled. Flag number 3, the reality distortion. Gaslighting about your perceptions and experiences. Remember Eduardo's attack on Felipe? You worked 40 years and have what to show for it? That wasn't just an insult. It was a strategic assault on Felipe's credibility. If Felipe is financially unsuccessful, then Felipe's opinions about finance and relationships are worthless. If Felipe's life is a failure, then Felipe's warnings about Eduardo must be motivated by jealousy rather than genuine concern. This is gaslighting, making you doubt your own perceptions by undermining your credibility to have those perceptions. It doesn't always look like someone saying, "That never happened," when it clearly did. Sometimes it looks like someone saying, "You're too sensitive," when you express hurt. You're remembering it wrong when you recall a conversation differently than they do. You're being dramatic when you point out a pattern of behavior. The key characteristic of gaslighting is that it targets your confidence in your own judgment. After enough exposure to it, you stop trusting your own memory, your own feelings, your own assessments of situations. Clara experienced this constantly. She'd express a concern, and Eduardo would reframe it as her being unsophisticated, jealous, influenced by her father's negativity. Eventually, Clara started second-guessing every concern before voicing it. Am I being unreasonable? Is this actually a problem, or am I just making it one? Now here's the counter move. The thing you should say when someone tries to gaslight you. I'm not asking you to agree with my perception. I'm stating my perception as a fact about my experience. You can disagree with whether my interpretation is correct, but you can't tell me I didn't experience what I experienced. What if someone continues to invalidate your experience after you've stated this? You're dealing with a gaslighter. Because a healthy person can say, I see that differently, here's my perspective, without needing you to admit your perspective is wrong. The test: keep a journal. Write down conversations, agreements, promises, not to use as ammunition later, but to have an objective record you can check against your memory. If you find yourself constantly surprised by how different your journal entry is from the other person's recollection, you're being gaslit. If you find yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, questioning memories you're certain of, or feeling crazy after conversations with someone, you're being gaslit. And if you find yourself needing to record conversations or screenshot texts just to prove to yourself that something happened the way you remember it happening, you're not paranoid. You're protecting yourself from someone actively distorting your reality. Flag number 4, the isolation. Us against the world as a trap. Eduardo systematically separated Clara from Felipe, her primary support system, and the person most likely to see through Eduardo's manipulation. He did it by framing Felipe as the problem, making Clara choose sides, punishing her with displeasure whenever she prioritized her father over Eduardo's comfort. This is isolation, and it's absolutely critical for maintaining control over someone. Because if Clara had maintained strong connections with people who knew her well and loved her unconditionally, those people would have provided competing perspectives. They would have said, this isn't normal when Eduardo's behavior escalated. They would have offered refuge when Clara needed to escape. Isolation doesn't usually look like you can't see your friends anymore. It looks like your friends don't really understand our relationship. They're still single. They don't get what commitment means. Your family is so negative. Why do we have to spend time with people who don't support us? I'm uncomfortable when you go out without me. It makes me feel like you're choosing them over us. The pattern is, every relationship you have outside the primary relationship is gradually framed as a threat to the primary relationship, and you're made to feel guilty for maintaining those connections. Clara mentioned that Eduardo wasn't comfortable with her spending time alone with Felipe. That's not a reasonable boundary. That's isolation. The test is straightforward. Make a list of the close relationships you had before your current relationship. Now cross off any that have faded, become strained, or ended since the relationship began. If more than half the list is crossed off, and your partner played a role in those losses, you're being isolated. Ask yourself, would my partner be happy if I spent an entire weekend with my best friend without them? If the answer is no, or if you'd feel guilty for even asking, you're being isolated. Ask yourself, do I have people in my life who would tell me the truth if they thought I was making a mistake, and would I be able to hear them? If you can't think of anyone, or if you know they'd tell you but you dismiss their concerns because your partner has taught you to, you're isolated. The counter move is to maintain your independent relationships aggressively. Make time for friends even when your partner sulks about it. Visit family even when your partner makes it clear they're unhappy. Cultivate a support network that exists outside your relationship, and refuse to sacrifice it for the relationship. Because here's the truth. A healthy partner wants you to have strong outside connections. They want you to have friends who challenge you, family who love you, a life that extends beyond the relationship. Because healthy partners aren't threatened by competing loyalties. They're enhanced by them. Flag number 5, the deadly escalation, the point of no return. This is the flag that appeared right before Clara called her father to rescue her. Eduardo's financial plan for the inheritance created without her input, presented as a fait accompli, defended with anger when questioned. The deadly escalation is when someone drops the mask, when they stop pretending to care about your opinion and reveal the transactional nature of the relationship. For Clara, it was Eduardo saying, "Once we're married, it will be our money, and you need to stop being selfish about it." For others, it might be, "If you don't do this, I'm leaving. You owe me this after everything I've done for you. I've invested too much in this relationship to let you ruin it with your uncertainty." The characteristic is, the relationship becomes explicitly conditional. There's no more pretense of partnership. It's an ultimatum. Comply or face consequences. This is the moment where you find out whether you're in a relationship or a transaction, because a partner says, "We disagree about this, let's find a compromise." And a transaction says, "My way or the highway." And the test is simple and brutal. What happens when you fundamentally disagree with your partner about something important? Do they respect your position even while disagreeing? Or do they escalate until you cave? Do they look for solutions that honor both perspectives? Or do they frame it as a loyalty test where choosing yourself means betraying them? Do they acknowledge your autonomy? Or do they remind you of everything they've sacrificed and demand reciprocal sacrifice? If disagreement routinely escalates to threats, ultimatums, or emotional punishment, you're not in a partnership. You're in a power struggle where your role is to lose. Clara's deadly escalation came when she questioned the financial plan. Eduardo's response wasn't, "Let's talk about this and find something we're both comfortable with." It was, "You're being ungrateful and selfish, and if you can't trust my judgment, maybe we shouldn't get married." That was the moment the mask fell off. The moment Eduardo revealed that the relationship was conditional on Clara's compliance. And, to Clara's credit, even in the midst of cognitive dissonance and trauma bonding, that was too much. That was the line she couldn't rationalize crossing. If you see this flag, the question is, what am I willing to sacrifice to maintain this relationship? And is the version of myself I'd have to become worth the relationship I'm trying to save? Because here's what Clara learned, and what you need to know. If someone requires you to sacrifice your autonomy, your judgment, your relationships, your financial security, or your sense of self to be with them, they don't love you. They love the version of you that serves their purposes, and that version is not who you actually are. So there's your evidence list. 5 red flags that almost guarantee a bad ending. 1. Love bombing, that creates dependency through overwhelming intensity. 2. Boundary violations where no is negotiated rather than respected. 3. Gaslighting that makes you doubt your own perceptions and experiences. 4. Isolation, disguised as intimacy, cutting you off from outside perspectives. 5. Deadly escalation where disagreement results in ultimatums and threats. If you see 2 or more of these in a relationship, you're not being paranoid to question it. You're being rational. You're recognizing a pattern that thousands of people before you have lived through and regretted not escaping sooner. And if you're seeing all 5, you're not in a relationship. You're in a psychological trap. And the only question is whether you'll recognize it in time to escape. You have the facts, the story of Felipe and Clara and Eduardo, the psychological mechanisms at play, the evidence list that could save your life or the life of someone you love. Now you must decide. Is this a tragedy of errors or a calculated manipulation? Was Felipe a controlling father who violated his daughter's autonomy, or a protective parent who recognized danger she couldn't see? Was Eduardo a maligned man who genuinely loved Clara, or a predator who saw her as a means to wealth? Was Clara a victim of manipulation, or a willing participant who needed to learn a hard lesson about trust and judgment? And what about that inheritance? Was it a blessing that gave Clara freedom, or a curse that attracted the wrong kind of attention and nearly destroyed her life. I'm handing the gavel to you. You've heard the testimony. You've examined the evidence. You've learned the psychology behind the behavior. Now render your verdict, not just about who was right or wrong in this specific case, but about the broader questions it raises. When is it okay for parents to deceive their children for their protection? How do you balance autonomy with safety when someone you love is making what you believe is a terrible mistake? What are the responsibilities of people who inherit sudden wealth? How do you recognize manipulation when you're in the middle of it, when your own brain is working against your best interests? The comments are open, the deliberations have begun. I want to hear every perspective, every verdict, every personal experience that this story triggered, because these questions don't have easy answers. They have your answers. Individual, contextual, based on your values and experiences and beliefs about love and family and money and trust. Clara and Felipe rebuilt their relationship. The inheritance gave Clara freedom to pursue a career that mattered to her rather than one that paid the bills. Eduardo moved on to his next target, proving that Clara was replaceable in his calculations. And Felipe learned that sometimes protecting someone means risking losing them, and sometimes losing them temporarily is the price of saving them permanently. But that's their ending. What's yours? Court is adjourned. See you in the comments.